Hi, all. It's Rabbi Travis. It's been a while since we've had a chance to speak. Um, I have some mixed thoughts about the lesson I want to share with you today, because ideally this would be something we would do face to face in person, something that would really lend itself, I think, to some really good give and take and some discussions. But we're not able to do that right now. Um, and so I wanted to share some documents, some thoughts with you about the founding fathers of our country. I just watched the other night a comedy show. John Oliver. He's got a weekly show this week, last week, or something like that. It airs on HBO, and you can actually watch it on YouTube if you don't have HBO. My wife and I were looking for something a little uplifting, a little humorous, and he had an episode on American history, which is a course I taught for a number of years. I have a passion for. It talked about all the things that are not taught properly and taught well. And it resonated with me because I always felt that way, and I always tried in my American history classes to teach things truthfully. And so I want to take a little time with you today um, to look at things about some of the better known, just a few examples, better known founders of our nation, um, to reinforce for us the need we have, especially in these times, to learn history properly. You might have heard the phrase the cancel culture. We're trying to eliminate the past. That's not what teaching history properly does. Teaching history properly gives us a context. It gives us an understanding, and it forces us to reflect on things carefully and honestly, and consider the impact that they have on our lives today. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to bounce around a little bit between screens because I want to share a number of different things with you. And I'm going to start um, with some notable quotes that come from the Revolutionary War period. Many of them I think you might have heard of or familiar with, and they reflect different points of views from some of our founding fathers, as they're called. I wanted to use these quotes to set the table so we understand the type of influence this generation had on our society even today. So John Adams said, "I must study politics and war that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." A beautiful philosophy. John Adams, the second president of the United States, a real mover and shaker uh, among the founding fathers, especially when it came to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. I've asked Amanda to look into the possibility of purchasing viewing privileges for one segment of an HBO special that they did on the life of John Adams. It's a 6-part documentary. This number 2 in the series focuses on the writing of the Declaration of Independence and gives you great insight to whom John Adams was. Not the best known of the founding fathers, one of my favorite. He, by the way, was one of the few founding fathers who did not own slaves. Benjamin Franklin, at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, very famously said, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Beautiful quote, beautiful idea. Benjamin Franklin's an interesting person. We're not going to talk much about him today. Worth studying, brilliant guy, inventor, impacted so many things at that time. Started the post office, Poor Richard's Almanac, said to have discovered electricity. That we all know about the kite and the rainstorm. He was a hound dog, a notorious woman's man. Left his wife behind when he was overseas as an ambassador to France. Complicated figure. Nathanael Greene, who was one of the leading American commanders after we achieved victory at Bunker Hill, said, "I wish we could sell them another hill at the same price." You can hear the excitement having defeated the British for the first time. Nathan Hale, very famously, he was hanged without a trial as a spy I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country. Everyone, especially our generation, heard that quote. Patrick Henry, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Thomas Jefferson, and we will talk about Thomas Jefferson. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which is in the Declaration of Independence. And it's interesting, he was very influenced by John Locke, who was a political philosopher, political theorist. In Locke's famous two treatises of government, Locke coined the phrase life, liberty, and estate. And Jefferson was very influenced by Locke, nonetheless changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That in itself is probably worth a whole discussion on what the difference is and how you move from something focused on property ownership and the acquisition of wealth in John Locke's worldview to Jefferson's worldview about personal freedoms, pursuit of happiness. Thomas Paine, which is a quote I think applies to our times as well. These are the times that try men's souls. John Paul Jones during the battle against the Separatists, I have not yet begun to fight. And Washington, when he spoke to the officers of Virginia Regiment, remember that it is the actions and not the commission that make the officer, and that there is more expected from him than the title. I wish more of our leaders took this to heart, that actions and not the office they hold is what really matters. And we expect more from people than merely the titles they hold. So background to give us, we know there were a remarkable generation of people. They came together and remarkably established an enduring form of democracy that's had a profound impact on world history. For all its shortcomings, perhaps, the American democratic system is remarkable. It's what makes us a great country. And it was unheard of. Remember, up to that time, all these men had known, the women also, were monarchies. You know, one of the most significant elections in American history, in all due respect to the election this year, which is will be quite significant. The election of 1800 was the first time in history we had the peaceful transference of power in the government. Washington became president in 1892. He ran for re-election in 1896. He voluntarily stepped down. He could have been president for life. And he understood that was a bad idea. I'm sorry, I'm going to back up. Washington served 2 terms of office, 1888. In 1896, he retired. John Adams became the second president. John Adams was from the same, there were no parties during Washington's lifetime. John Adams succeeded Washington, became the second president. Thomas Jefferson was his vice president. In those days, whoever got the second highest vote total became vice president. Adams and Jefferson did not get along. They were from competing parties. Jefferson was an anti-federalist. Adams was a federalist. In 1800, Jefferson runs and defeats Adams. And Adams gives him literally and figuratively the keys to the White House. 1800, the first election in history, peaceful transference of power. President Trump would do well to remember the lesson of that election. So we have a remarkable system. I want to show you an interesting fact. And then we'll get started. There were 55 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. 41 of them owned slaves. 41 of them. Let that sink in. 41 out of the 55 members of the Continental Congress who drafted and signed the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. And I mention this because we're at a time of increased demands for social justice, calls and accusations of systemic racism in our country, things that we should be addressing straight up, openly and honestly. And we have a problem doing that. For instance, let me show you something else. Those of you who have access to computers in your home might be interested in doing this. The New York Times Let me read this and I'll explain to you what it is. In August of 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the English colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists. No aspect of the country that will be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. In other words, slavery was introduced into North America in 1619. On the 400th anniversary of this fateful moment, it is finally time to tell our story truthfully. So the New York Times had launched something called the 1619 Project. It is an ongoing initiative that began, as it says, in August 2019, the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. It aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black America at the very center of our national narrative. In other words, it's not something that we paper over. It's not something we kind of maybe talk about in the context of the Civil War. It's not something that we ignore because some people will, I learned history this way and I refuse to teach it this way. Civil War was not about slavery, but it was about states' rights. That's nonsense. Maybe when we're back live, I will teach you my American history course. We'll see how. But this is so contentious, just to give an example, that Tom Cotton, a U.S. Senator, has proposed legislation that would bar federal funds going to any school that adopts the 1619 curriculum for its American history project courses. And so we from the get-go, don't deal openly with the impact of slavery on our country. So I want to give you just a few examples. And so we'll get a sense of what's going on. Let's start with George Washington. Right? Hang on, I have a different article I want to share with you on George Washington. It's a little annoying. I've got to share a screen bar that comes up. Here we go. George Washington. This is a piece that I used in my American history classes always. I'm going to read it to you because we don't normally equate Washington with slave ownership. Washington owned more than 100 slaves. The myth is that he freed them on his death. He didn't. There was one of his slaves that were emancipated. They were supposed to be freed upon the death of his wife, Martha. So let's read what this has to say. And I apologize for reading things to you. If we were doing this live, I'd give you handouts. We would read them together and discuss it. But I want to give you the sense, and these articles are often written in much more eloquently and more to the point than me summarize them. Amid the cars and mattress sales that serve as markers for President's Day, Black History Month reminds Americans to focus on our common history. In 1926, the African-American historian Carter G. Woodson introduced Negro History Week as a commemoration built around the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Now February serves as a point of collision between presidential celebration and marginalized Black history. While Lincoln's role in the ending of slavery is understood to have been more nuanced than his reputation as a great emancipator would suggest, and as an aside, that's true. I think we've talked about it. Those of you who remember the class I did on Juneteenth, Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation really did not free the slaves. Abraham Lincoln, even though he's seen as the person who brought about the end of slavery by modern standards, he'd be seen as a terrible racist. Again, and that's not a condemnation. It's a fact, and we have to remember that when we look at these historical figures, we can't impose our values on them. They lived at a different time and place. Now, I say that with a caveat, the caveat being slavery was terrible. I don't think there's any context that justifies the enslavement of other human beings and the treatment that the Blacks often received in the South. So let's give that as a taken. Let's continue. It has taken longer for us to replace stories about cherry trees and false teeth with narratives about George Washington's slaveholding. When he was 11 years old, Washington inherited 10 slaves from his father's estate. Let that sink in. At 11 years old, he was already owning slaves. He owned 10 other human beings at the age of 11. He continued to acquire slaves, some through the death of family members and others through direct purchase. Washington's cache of enslaved people peaked in 1759 when he married the wealthy widow Martha Dandridge Curtis. His new wife brought more than 80 slaves to the estate of Mount Vernon. On the eve of the American Revolution, nearly 150 souls were counted as part of the property there. In 1789, Washington became the first president of the United States, a planter president who used and sanctioned black slavery. Washington needed slave labor to maintain his wealth, his lifestyle, and his reputation. As he aged, Washington flirted with attempts to extricate himself from the murderous institution, to get quit of Negroes, as he famously wrote in 1778, but he never did. During the president's 2 terms in office, the Washingtons relocated first to New York and then to Philadelphia. Although slavery had steadily declined in the North, the Washingtons decided that they could not live without it. Once settled into Philadelphia, Washington encountered his first roadblock to slave ownership in the region, Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. The act began dismantling slavery, eventually releasing people from bondage after their 28th birthdays. Under the law, any slave who entered Pennsylvania with an owner and lived in the state for longer than 6 months would be set free automatically. This presented a problem for the new president. You can see where this is going, right? Washington developed a canny strategy that would protect his property and allow him to avoid public scrutiny. Every 6 months, the president's slaves would travel back to Mount Vernon or would journey with Mrs. Washington outside the boundaries of the state. In essence, the Washingtons reset the clock. The president was secretive when writing to his personal secretary, Tobias Lear, in 1791. I request that these sentiments and this advice may be known to none but yourself and Mrs. Washington. The president went on to support policies that would protect slave owners who had invested money in black lives. In 1793, Washington signed the first fugitive slave law, which allowed fugitives to be seized in any state, tried, and returned to their owners. Anyone who harbored or assisted a fugitive faced a $500 penalty and possible imprisonment. Okay? Which meant that if you were a slave and you escaped to the North, you weren't necessarily safe. That's why many escaped slaves went up to Canada. Very famously, Martha Washington had a slave named Betty who worked with her for years, and Martha was prepared to give Betty away at the age of 22 to one of Martha's granddaughters upon her marriage. The granddaughter was an awful person. Betty didn't want to be treated such, and she ran away. And Washington hunted her down. He never caught her. She managed to elude capture and made it up to Canada, but he ran ads in the northern press. His wife wanted her slave back. And George worked very diligently without success to try and recapture Betty. $500 penalty back then was a fortune. Washington almost made it through his 2 terms in office without a major incident. On a spring evening in May of 1796, though, Ona Judge, the Washington's 22-year-old slave woman, I just referred to it, slipped away from the president's house in Philadelphia. At 15, she joined the Washingtons on the tour of northern living. She was among a small cohort of 9 slaves who lived with the president's family in Philadelphia. Judge was Martha Washington's first attendant. She took care of Mrs. Washington's personal needs. Okay, so if she was been with the Washingtons for 7 years when she ran away. What prompted Judge's decision to bold, as I told you, she was going to be given to Washington's granddaughter. She fled Philadelphia for Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a city at that time had 360 free black people and virtually no slaves. Within a few months of her arrival, Judge married Jack Staines, a free black sailor, with whom she had 3 children. Judge and her offspring were vulnerable to slave catchers. They lived as free people, but legally belonged to Martha Washington. Washington's agencies pursued Judge for 3 years, dispatching friends, officials, and relatives to find and recapture her. 12 weeks before his death, Washington was still actively pursuing her, but with the help of close allies, Judge managed to elude his slave-catching grasp. Washington died on December 14, 1799. At the time of his death, 318 enslaved people lived at Mount Vernon, and fewer than half of them belonged to the former president. Washington's will called for the emancipation of his slaves following the death of his wife. He completed in death what he had been unwilling to do while living, an act made easier because he had no biological children expecting an inheritance. Martha lived until 1802, and upon her death, all her human property went to inheritors. She emancipated none of her slaves. When asked by reporters if she had regrets about leaving the Washingtons, Judge responded, "No, I am free and I have, I trust, been made a child of God by the means." Ona Judge died in 1848. She has earned a salute during this month of February. Okay, so they correct the article. She did not emancipate her own slaves, as the essay noted, but in 1801 she freed all of his slaves as he had requested. Okay. The point here is this. You probably never learned this about George Washington. This sort of a side of Washington is rarely taught. It doesn't diminish his achievement as the first president. Washington shaped the modern presidency. Washington could have been king or emperor had he so chosen. He could have been president for life. He put country first. There's a wonderful book called The Quartet, which talks about how Madison and Hamilton and John Jay lured Washington out of retirement when they were trying to draft the U.S. Constitution. The Articles of Confederation were failing, and they said to Washington essentially, look, your legacy, you defeated the British, you founded this country, your legacy will mean nothing if the country falls apart, and it will under the Articles of Confederation. And they told him, they knew the only way the proposed Constitution would pass would be if Washington agreed to be president, which he reluctantly did. He was happy being a farmer. He'd spent most of his adult life serving the country, and he went back into service of his country. A great man, but he was a product of his times. He owned slaves. He, as a Southerner, as a plantation owner, he could not figure out how to profitably run his plantation without slaves. And so we should talk about that and have a discussion. What does this mean? We don't cancel George Washington. I don't think anyone would propose tearing down the Washington Monument on the Mall in Washington, named for our first president, because he owned slaves. As we said, 41 of the 55 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. Slavery was as they say, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, or the elephant in the room, during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. The southern states would not have come on board had slavery been abolished. The Constitution avoids direct confrontation with slavery, but it's indirect. You have the infamous 3/5 clause. When the Constitution was being drafted and the structure of the government was being discussed, and the Great Connecticut Compromise was put into place, that you had a Senate where the states were equal, they had equal votes, each state has 2 senators, and you have a House where membership is based on state population, so the larger states have a larger vote. It's a bicameral legislature, and I think we've discussed this in the past. The question was, how do you count the number of citizens, the people that give you votes? And Virginia, for one, was a very large state, very rich state, but a majority of its residents were slaves, and they weren't prepared to recognize them as human beings. But the Virginians wanted them counted so they would have more representatives in the House. So the compromise, you counted a black person as 3/5 of a human being. And this is part of our history. It's a shameful part of our history, but it needs to be taught, it needs to be discussed. Let me next talk about James Madison. James Madison went on to be president. James Madison was the 4th president, but he he was very involved in the drafting of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, are his work. He and Hamilton wrote most of the Federalist paper, which were really propaganda pieces run in the newspapers in New York to try and influence the vote towards ratification of the Constitution. New York was the largest state at the time, and without its ratification, the Constitution would not have passed. So let's see what we see about Madison the racist. Madison was also a Southern farmer. When we think about the framers of the Constitution and how they handled the issue of race, we conjure up the extremes, the hypocrites and the heroes. At one end is Thomas Jefferson. We're going to talk about Jefferson next, who wrote that all men are created equal, but believed Africans were inferior and fathered children with an enslaved woman. At the other end is Alexander Hamilton, who, at least as depicted by admirers like the biographer Ron Chernow and the playwright Lin-Manuel Miranda, was an ardent abolitionist. This framing, however, is simplistic and misleading. It is simplistic because it overlooks the harder to categorize positions like that of James Madison, the lead drafter of the Constitution, who genuinely rejected the idea of racial inferiority, yet still failed to put his beliefs in equality and liberty into practice. And it is misleading because it implies that as long as we avoid having racist attitudes, we can succeed in avoiding racist policies. We think that if we're not Jefferson, we must be Hamilton, but that is not the case. In this respect, Madison is the founding father who can teach Americans the most about our present contradictions on race. Madison is still insisted that enslaved Africans were entitled to a right to liberty and proposed that Congress purchase all the slaves in the United States and set them free. Very radical. Yet, not only did he hold slaves on his plantation in Virginia and failed to free them upon his death, but he also originated the notorious 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, which counted a slave as 3/5 of a person for purposes of legislative representation. The tension between Madison's aspirational beliefs and his highly constrained action continues to be America's own tension. Like Madison, contemporary United States society rejects racial inequality in principle. And we have laws in place to try and protect, ensure that racial inequality is not tolerated, right? But also like Madison, a majority of Americans, as reflected in our democratic institutions, are ultimately unwilling or unable to make the costly changes that would be necessary to achieve equality in practice. Most of what can be learned about Madison's racial attitudes is found in letters of his that remain largely unexplored. In one astonishing document written in 1783, he explained to his father that he faced a quandary with respect to an enslaved man named Billy, whom Madison had brought with him to Philadelphia as his manservant when he was in Congress. Madison wrote that he could not bring Billy back to the family plantation because after Billy had experienced the relative freedom of Pennsylvania, his mind is too thoroughly tainted to be a fit companion for his fellow slaves in Virginia. Madison could not think of punishing him, he wrote, merely for coveting that liberty for which we have paid the price of so much blood and have proclaimed so often to be the right and worthy pursuit of every human being. In other words, Billy possessed the same right of liberty as every human being, the right they fought for in the Revolutionary War. But it was a time of economic crisis. Madison felt he could not free Billy because he could not afford to. Its compromise was to sell Billy into a term of indentured servitude, as allowed by Pennsylvania law, at the end of which he would become free. Madison therefore got some value for his slave while satisfying his conscience. At the end of his term of service, Billy was indeed free, taking the name William Gardner, marrying and staying in Philadelphia, where Madison continued to have contact with him for years. Okay, Madison's compromise was, I can't afford to set him free. I'll get some money. So he'll remain a slave, but for a limited amount of time, not forever. How do you evaluate that? How do you discuss that? And frankly, these are the type of things we should be discussing among ourselves, with our kids in schools, and force them to think, what would you do? You know, do you have to give up all your principles for economic reasons? Do you have to suffer financially to keep your principles whole? Can you make compromises like Madison did? I don't know what the answer is, but I know these are worthwhile discussions, and I think that's what people who've been marching and protesting since the murder of George Floyd are asking for. Let's have open and honest discussion about what goes on in our country, and let's admit where we're falling short of the mark. Let's acknowledge where we make compromises that are not ideal, but they're improvement. And let's find some areas where we should go the whole way. Madison understood perfectly well that slavery was morally wrong and why, but he also could not overcome the economic reality on which his entire livelihood and that of his family plantation was based. Thanks to Madison's influence, his characteristic treatment of race, principled ideas followed by compromise, made its way into the Constitution itself. The story begins in 1783, 4 years before the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress had asked the states for annual contributions of money determined proportionally based on population. Southerners wanted to count slaves as little as possible to reduce their share, right? You see the irony. They wanted to count them when votes were at stake. They don't want to count them when money's at stake. Northerners wanted to count slaves fully so that the South would pay more. Madison proposed counting 3/5 of slaves as a compromise, believing it was very near the true ratio with respect to taxable wealth produced by them. All but 2 states approved the proposal, but because unanimity was required, it did not pass. Okay? You see what this laid the groundwork for, right? At the Constitutional Convention in 1797, the tables were turned. Southerners wanted to count slaves fully to increase their legislative representation, while Northerners argued that slaves who couldn't vote should not be counted at all. The 3/5 compromise was adopted precisely because everyone knew that the number had been used when both sides saw things the other way. Madison was happy to see it adopted. So yeah, think about it. It's a compromise that works, but what it says to Black Americans at that time was, you're not fully human. You're 60% human. Okay. There was also the issue of the constitutional provision that preserved the slave trade for 20 years after ratification. Importantly, the Constitution did not ban slavery, but it allowed for the importation of slaves only for 20 more years. So in 1808, importation of new slaves became illegal, which I think the people pushed for it naively thought it might bring an end to the institution. Frankly, what it did was it turned slave owners into breeders. So Thomas Jefferson will talk about that in a minute or two. Slave owners became breeders because if you couldn't bring in new slaves, then you forced your slaves to either marry or simply have sex to produce children whom you could use or sell, right? Madison strongly objected to it. Like other slaveholders, he considered trade in slaves more odious than ownership. Yet when it became clear that South Carolina and Georgia, backed by Connecticut, insisted on protecting slave trade as a condition for agreeing to the Constitution, Madison went along. Reaching consensus was paramount. Without the guarantee of slavery and the slave trade, there would have been no Constitution, and that was Madison's highest priority. So when it's, modern people would say sold his soul to the devil. Getting the Constitution, putting into place a system of government that would endure. The governmental form established by the Articles of Confederation didn't work. We weren't a country. We were 13 provinces, states, each with its own currency, its own laws. It was unworkable. And Madison, like the people who work with him to get the Constitution written and ratified, understood. Unless you fixed it, everything they fought so hard for, the freedom they won from Britain, would disappear. Connecticut, by the way, I think the state won the slave trade because it made a lot of money from the importing slaves in its port. Further demonstrating the tension between his beliefs and his action, Madison called for abolition, but only in private. In 1790, after drafting the Bill of Rights, Madison argued in a letter for creating a colony in Africa to resettle freed slaves. By the way, this idea persisted. Abraham Lincoln brought it up when he's running for president. And in the beginning of his presidency, this would have been his preferred outcome. Let's take all the black Americans and send them back to Africa, create a colony there for them. That would, he said, afford the best hope yet presented for putting an end to slavery, in which not less than 600,000 unhappy Negroes are now involved. I think the number is much higher than 600,000. His reason for sending former slaves to Africa was the prejudice of the whites, which would make integrating free blacks impossible. He thought that because prejudice derived principally from the difference of color, it must be considered as permanent and insuperable. Years later, Madison proposed that Congress sell the public the Western lands, including Louisiana Purchase, to raise $600 million to purchase and free all 1.5 million slaves. Fascinating, right? But ultimately, Madison could not afford even to free his own slaves in his will. According to family law, he left separate instructions to Dolly, his wife, to emancipate his slaves upon her death. If this message in fact existed, she was unable or unwilling to fulfill it. Sounds a little bit like Martha, doesn't it? Madison's contradictions resonate with our own vexed racial situation. From the 14th Amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and affirmative action, America, at its best, has repeatedly aspired to establish racial equality in the face of our past slavery and segregation. That is what we aspire to, and our aspirations are what make us a great country. Yet, the need to accommodate the realities of economics, politics, and the prejudice of others, which is to say, the difficulty that even well-intentioned people can have in accepting the true cost of meaningful change, has continued to hold back equality in practice. And that's where we stand today, very much so. Madison had many remarkable qualities. He was a constitutional genius, an accomplished statesman, and a calm, rational leader, even in wartime. When it came to race, however, he had feet of clay, as do most Americans still. Our founders can serve as important role models for us, provided we try to learn from their mistakes and flaws, as well as their successes and virtues. And I believe in that, right? Talking about these things, looking at the issues Madison wrestled with, looking at the compromises he made that went against his principles, are important. You know, it's easy for us to say, oh, I would have freed the slaves if I were in his shoes. Maybe you would have. Maybe you wouldn't have. You don't know. Look, I'll explain it this way. One of my favorite stories I learned from my teachers many years ago. So there's a law in Judaism that you have to try and return lost objects that you find. And so the rabbi is teaching his class of students throughout the following scenario. Ask the students, what would you do if you found a bag of gold? Again, the law in Jewish law is you need to make every possible effort to return lost items. So the first student raises his hand and he says, Rabbi, of course I would try and find the owner. And the rabbi said, you're a fool. The second student raised his hand and said, Rabbi, I would keep the money. And his logic, I'm sure, was there's no identification. How are you going to find who really owns it? Of course, you say, does anyone lose a bag of gold? There's a lot of takers. He said, I would keep it, meaning I know I can't find the owner. If I can't find the owner, it's rightfully mine. The rabbi said to the student, you're a thief. The third student raised his hand and said, Rabbi, I don't know what I would do until I were to find myself in that situation. The rabbi said, aha. That was the answer he was looking for. And so it's easy today, when many of us live very comfortable lives, to say, oh, I would have done such and such and such and such. But we don't know for sure. And I can say that even acknowledging that the horrors of slavery were horrible. You know, if you've ever read any accounts of the slaves as they're being brought from Africa to this country, beyond horrific, beyond horrific. And it's a blight on our record as a country. But I don't think it's one we need to shy away from. In other words, to me at least, And I always try to make this point in the classroom with my students. One of the things that makes America great and ought to make us great is our willingness to confront the past and try and learn from the past. This notion of make America great again, I think is silly, because I think America's always been great. I think those who mouth make America great again are really saying we want America to look like it did in the 1950s. My wife, a number of years ago, was having a discussion with her dad, and he was waxing eloquent and remembering how great the 50s were. And she looked at him and said, you know, Dad, the 50s really were great if you're white and you were a man. And he stopped and he thought about it for a minute and said, you're right. Okay. Let me close with what the article hinted at, and I want to look a little bit at Thomas Jefferson. If you've heard about Jefferson and Sally Hemings, this is not news to you. So let's read this, and I'll make a few observations, because to me, this is the most difficult of the founding fathers. Jefferson words in the Declaration of Independence resonate to this day. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, but we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created, that they are endowed by a creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Everyone knows these. You probably rattled them off with me. But when we said we hold these truths that all men are created equal, they really should have been an asterisk, and it meant all white men, age 17 and older, who own property, because that's what men meant in this document, right? And Jefferson is problematic enough, as we're going to discuss right now, that there are certain people, certain curriculum, who have banished Jefferson. We can't talk about Thomas Jefferson. He's a hypocrite. And the question I always ask my students when I talk to them about Jefferson, and I had them research Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and I had them write a research paper. And one of the questions I asked them was to reflect on was Jefferson a product of his times, meaning 41 of 55 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. What's the big deal? They all own slaves. I mean, you know, it's a big deal, you know what I mean? Or was Jefferson over the top even by the standards of his own time period? And I further asked him, I said, if you were in charge of creating curriculum, would you leave Thomas Jefferson in your textbook or not? Oh, that's Monticello. I had a chance years ago to visit there. It's a beautiful place. Jefferson was one smart fellow. Terrible with money. It's one of the reasons he could never free his slaves. I mean, he was constantly at the brink of bankruptcy, and so much so that the Library of Congress, which is such a treasure in our country, was started when it purchased Thomas Jefferson's library. Thomas Jefferson sold the U.S. government 25,000 books. 25,000 books. Jefferson's library became the first Library of Congress. All right, so let's look at this article. It has been 20 years since the historian Annette Gordon Reed published Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, a book that successfully challenged the prevailing perceptions of both figures. In a piece for the New York Times Book Review submitted just before the tragic events in Charlottesville, Gordon Reed reflects on the complexities that endure in our understanding of Hemings and the language we use to characterize her. So let me just, by way of background, Jefferson's wife and Sally Hemings were half sisters. They had the same father. So clearly, Sally Hemings' father raped her mother. Forgive me. There was no such thing as consensual sex between the white master and the black female slaves. And I have to tell you, I've never understood how men who claim that blacks were less than human sometimes lusted so mightily after the female slaves. Just blows my mind. Anyway, Sally Hemings supposedly looked very much like Jefferson's wife. And when Jefferson's wife died, he took Hemings on as a lover. They found they had 6 children together. At least 4 of them, if I remember correctly, 4 of them he maintained as slaves. I think he freed them at the age of 21, but he enslaved his own children. Sally Hemings came with him to France when Jefferson was sent there as an ambassador. And she didn't want to come back with him to America because she was a free woman in France. And she came back because he made promises to her how he would treat their children. Okay. And so that's the question we ask. How can this man write that life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal, and not only own slaves, but enslave his own children? Right? So let's read what she has to say. And we'll conclude with this reflection on Jefferson. Sally Hemings has been described as an enigma, the enslaved woman who first came to public notice at the turn of the 19th century when James Callender, an enemy of the newly elected president, Thomas Jefferson, wrote the racist virulence of Sally, who lived at Monticello and had borne children by Jefferson. Hemings came back into news earlier this year after the Thomas Jefferson Foundation announced plans to restore a space where Hemings likely resided for a time at Monticello. A number of new reports, as well as comments on social media discussing the plans, drew the ire of many readers because they referred to Hemings as Jefferson's mistress and used the word relationship to describe the connection between the pair, as if those words inevitably denote positive things. They do not, of course, especially when the word mistress is modified by the crucial word enslaved. Okay? I don't think any of us know because they didn't know. She was a slave, no question. Was she forced into a relationship with him? Maybe. Did he have feelings for her? Probably, given her physical resemblance to his departed wife. Given the fact that they maintained this relationship for many, many years, it wasn't that he had forced sex upon a slave. They had 6 children together. He took her to France. I don't know how to describe the relationship. Did she have feelings for him other than resentment? I don't know. Right? It's a complicated situation. When I published my first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, in 1997, most people knew of Hemings from 2 works: Fawn Brody's biography, Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History, and Barbara Chase Ryboud's novel, Sally Hemings, 1979, both of which sought to rescue Hemings' personhood. More typically, the scholarship written to disprove her connection to Jefferson routinely diminished Hemings' humanity. Right? There's a whole debate, because the descendants of Sally Hemings, for years there were reunions at Monticello of Jefferson's descendants, and the white descendants didn't want the black descendants to be part of it. The argument is that a story couldn't be true because Jefferson would never be involved with a slave girl, and that such a person was too low to have influenced Jefferson, reoccurred in various formulations in historical writings over many years, as if the designation slave girl told readers all they need to know. By the way, there was, among the protectors, so to speak, of Jefferson's reputation legacy, they argued that the DNA ties that show the descendants of Sally Hemingtons were fathered by Jefferson. They said, no, it wasn't Jefferson. It was one of his white children had relations with Sally Hemings. So Jefferson himself couldn't have done it. It was his son. My first book was designed to explore the inanity of those and other arguments. I wrote a second book, The Hemings of Monticello, An American Family, to flesh out Hemings' personal history. As the battle over whether Hemings and Jefferson had been in a relationship has receded, the question of what type of relationship they could possibly have been in has come to the fore. A recent Washington Post piece, reflecting on the terminology used in the announcement of the Restoration Project, insisted that Hemings should be seen primarily as Jefferson's property, noting that by law he could compel her to have sex, rape her, whenever he wanted. Another Post article about Hemings that appeared earlier in the year had used the words mistress and relationship, drawing critical responses. Another commentator said Hemings should be thought of as a sex trafficked slave. Even Teen Vogue weighed in. As a slave, Hemings was not afforded the privilege of self-determination, meaning she didn't do what she wanted. She did what she was told. And I'm going to step in and say, you know what? There were a lot of white women in that era who couldn't do what they wanted. They did what they were told because women had curtailed rights also, not just black women. These were understandable interventions given the desire so many people still have to portray slavery as less monstrous than it was. At the same time, the talk in these rejoinders of Hemings as simply property, as if she were akin to an inanimate object or non-sentient beings, turns aside decades of historiography that make clear that enslaved people, when they had chances, often acted to shape their circumstances to the extent that they could. The language echoes the arguments of Jefferson scholars who treated Hemings' legal status as a definitive answer to the question of what did and did not happen in her life. It's true, Hemings was by law Jefferson's property, but she was also a human being. Contingency, which historians know is always in operation, plays a crucial role in human affairs, and it did so in the way the law of property shaped Hemings' story. Enigmatic as she may be, Hemings had a vision of her life and self that she imparted to her family. Her son Madison Heming relayed that vision in recollections notable for their bare-bone clarity and the extent to which his statements can be corroborated. By the way, I'm going to just switch screens. Let's see. And I'm doing this just to show you. Again, if you have a computer, you can Google the memoirs of Madison Hemings, and you can read them. Okay, they're not so very long with that still exists, but it's very fascinating. Okay, so let me go back to our article. Her vision should always matter when we write about her. Law was pivotal to Hemings' understanding of her life. She knew its power. For a brief but life-defining moment, just over 2 years, she, unlike the vast majority of enslaved people, was in a place where the law was on her side. It was a tool she could use. Very critically, both she and Jefferson believed that, these 2 years when she was in France. Sally Hemings had the extraordinary experience of living in pre-revolutionary Paris. Throughout the 18th century, every petition for freedom in that city was granted. She and undoubtedly her brother James, 8 years her senior, had been in France for training to be a chef for 3 years before she arrived, understood that the laws of Virginia did not automatically apply in France. Jefferson was on the defensive about this his entire time in the country. That is almost certainly why he put James and Sally Hemings on the payroll with other servants at his residence, the Hotel de Lange. The siblings were paid wages nearly the very highest rate in the city for a chef de cuisine and a chambermaid. They had access to other people of color, as their neighborhood had the greatest concentration of such people in Paris, a small group who helped one another. They were also lawyers who filed petitions on behalf of these slaves. They did so pro bono and for money, which the Hemings siblings had. At some point, Sally Hemings became Mr. Jefferson's concubine, in the words of Madison Hemings. In 1789, pregnant by Jefferson, she refused to return to Virginia and be re-enslaved. Were she to return, any child born there would be enslaved. This was a bold gambit for a 16-year-old, even in a time unlike today when females at that age were not thought of as children. The age of consent in Virginia in the 1780s was 10. It was raised to 12 in 1820. Unbelievable. It is easy to see how her experiences and the energy and optimism of youth led her to think she could do this. She learned to speak French well, and she was not alone. She had James, whose decision near the end of his stay to hire a tutor to help him perfect his French grammar suggests he thought they could survive there. They had seen a different world, different possibilities in it. As always, context matters. None of the other young people at the Hotel de Lange, nor Jefferson's daughters, nor not his secretary, William Short, wanted to return to America. Interesting. His eldest daughter, Martha, was thinking of ways to remain. To get Sally Hemings to come back with him, Jefferson promised her a good life in Monticello and that their children would be freed when they became adults. Madison Hemings said that his mothers implicitly relied on Jefferson's promises, a statement that troubled me when I first wrote about Hemings. Subjects often exasperate biographers. It was not until I began researching my second book that I could find any probable reason why she might do this. Hemings and Jefferson did not exist in a vacuum. They were part of a web of family relationships in Monticello that mattered to both of them. Hemmings shared a father, John Whalings, with Jefferson's wife, Martha. Such connections were rarely meaningful to the whites involved, and the enslaved likely had no expectation about them. But the connection clearly meant something to Jefferson, who saw the Hemmings family through the prism of his deep feelings for his wife, whose death before he went to Paris shattered him. Sally Hemings could not have missed Jefferson's response to her family for stretches of her childhood until he freed them. Jefferson didn't know where her brothers were as they went off to hire their own time, which was against the law, and keep the money they earned. Hemings and her sisters, and like all the others on the mountain, were totally exempted from field work, even during harvest time. An overseer remembered Jefferson instructing him not to exercise any power over the Hemings women. What did this mean for the institution of slavery in America? What did it mean for hundreds of other people Jefferson enslaved during his lifetime? Virtually nothing, as it did not transform American slavery or change the lives of others enslaved on Jefferson's plantations. But it meant a great deal to the 6 Heming Whalens children, who had very different lives and destinies than others enslaved in Monticello. The need to write about enslaved people sociologically, what happened to the group as a whole, should not foreclose considerations of individual enslaved people's lives. We learn much about the institutions from both perspectives. Let's finish up, then I want to make an observation. Hemings, with the aid of what she and Jefferson considered to be the power of French law, extracted promises from Jefferson. When they returned to Virginia, however, his power was again plenary. He could have reneged on it all, but he did not. He kept his promises, as Madison Hemings notes, asserting in another part of the recollection that this was a rare thing for whites to do when dealing with blacks. Of the near 700 people Jefferson owned over the course of his life, Sally Hemings and her children were the only nuclear family to leave slavery at Monticello at Jefferson's evident direction. Though enslaved, Sally Hemings helped shape her life and the lives of her children, who got an almost 50-year head start on emancipation, escaping the system that engulfed their ancestors and millions of others. Whatever we may feel about it today, this was important to her. Wow. What a complex story. And think how meaningful it would be to us as adults and to our children as high school age and college if they learned American history through such filters. I don't mean a pun, but history is never black and white. There's so much gray here. And yes, Jefferson is a hypocrite. Yes, Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was a great president. How do we reconcile all these? Well, we have to step back and say he was a flawed human being. Sally Hemings was not merely property. Sally Hemings was not merely a slave, even though she was enslaved. It was a complex relationship. And so it seems to me the challenge we face in these challenging times is to step back and try and take it all in. So we can learn from past history. Jefferson is 200 plus years ago. From recent history, all the horrific examples of African Americans who were saying to arresting officers, "I can't breathe," and end up being dead. And this is not to condemn all police officers. There are a lot of brave men and women who put their lives on the line every single day to keep Americans around the country safe. Most of them are good, hardworking people. But you have to ask yourself, what kind of system do we have? In the case of George Floyd, where 3 other police officers stood back and watched that one guy put his knee on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes until he died. How do you not step forward and say, "You're killing him, stop"? These are fair questions. And I don't think the answer is simply to cancel everything or defund everything or tear down every question. The answer is to step back and say, good, not good. The answer is to step back and say, what do we learn from these instances? What do we learn from our past world and the world around us? And how do we take those lessons to make our country moving forward a better place? And so I shared these examples with you because far too often we never talk about these aspects of Washington or Madison or Jefferson or go down a long, long list of really pivotal people in the history of our country. We don't often talk about women or people of color who did great things for our country, but they just don't get any recognition. I'm going back to my um, curriculum page. There's a book called Founding Mothers, the women who raised our nation. Another great book. I used it in my history class. It's not taught. The women behind the founding fathers had a great deal to say about what went on. And they were important in their own right, and they don't get enough credit. So I'm sort of getting off topic a little bit, but I hope you found this interesting. I wish we could have done this together. I think we would have had some fascinating discussions. I think you would have all had a lot to add from your personal experiences about what you remember learning in school, from what you lived during your lifetime. Those of you who might have grown up in the South and saw firsthand segregation and reflect on things. Um, so anyway, I hope you, let me stop sharing my screen. I hope, as I said, you'll find this interesting. I hope much sooner than later, I'll be allowed back in your building, and we can start learning face to face again. So stay well, stay healthy, and I hope to speak to you all not too distant future. Take care. Bye bye.